I'm reading the book A Face to the World by Laura Cumming on self-portrait. This is chapter 4, Motive, Means, and Opportunity. At the dead center of the Last Judgment, within touching distance of Jesus Christ, Michelangelo makes an appearance. He's not on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, where you would have to crane your neck to spot him in the soaring multitude, but right there in plain view above the altar. The artist who has painted the dawn of creation from the moment God imparts the spark of life to Adam, now appears at the last trump to face God. But all he shows of himself is a skin, limp as leather, dangling from the hand of a saint. There and not there, Michelangelo is no more than his own after casing, displayed as the flayed skin of a Bartholomew who was martyred for his faith. And while the Bartholomew is a magnificent creature, muscle-bound, heroic, turning his classical head towards Jesus, exactly as one might imagine Michelangelo, a figure powerful enough to wrestle whole worlds into being. The artist is just an empty overcoat hitched to a rubber mask. Yet Michelangelo was immediately recognizable to his contemporaries, as he is now, even in this exiguous state. He is known to have scorned portraiture, especially the scrupulously accurate Northern European variety James Boswell hoped to emulate one depicting Dr. Johnson in his biography in the style of the Flemish, exacting every hair, even every spot on his countenance. To the Florentine, this was just a tedious imitation, aspiring to nothing more than the banality of fact. A child of the Italian Renaissance, a student of the classical fragments in the gardens of the Medici Villa, Michelangelo believed in the poetry of perfection, the ideal figure, the transcendence of the spirit over the mortal clay. Vasari, who knew him well, even claims that Michelangelo refused to make portraits because he hated drawing any living subject unless it were of exceptional beauty. And when commissioned to sculpt Lorenzo and Galliano Medici, the artist himself confessed to giving them a grandeur they certainly were not born with. The fact these effigies in the Medici chapel scarcely look like human beings at all. And when critics disquiet them as implausible, Michelangelo famously retorted that in 1,000 years nobody would know or care what the Medici looked like. The same is not true of the artist himself, a man who presents such an image of a total creative power, the immense scale of his imagination, the sheer force of his labor. From the gigantic block of marble to the sleepless nights and days on the Sistine scaffold, always striving to achieve ever greater figures. That admiration for his art shades into admiration for the imagined man, long before Charlton Heston bared his biceps in the agony and the asceticism. Michelangelo was already in danger of becoming art's Superman, a cartoon Vasari inspired with his praise of the artist's prodigious muscle power. But Michelangelo does not collude with this legend in the Sistine self-portrait. Quite the opposite. He presents himself as a man entirely without power. In his self-portraits, Michelangelo is always more concerned with the inner soul than the afterman. As the model for Nicodemus, helping to bear the body of Christ in a marble pieta, he sculpts himself with head reverentially bowed and hooded, prayer embodied. As the flayed skin in the Last Judgment, he is not so much portrayed as disembodied. Yet each self-portrait has its distinguishing characteristic that alone might represent him, as Van Gogh has his wounded ear, as Dali has his mustache, Michelangelo has his broken nose. It was smashed in a fight with a fellow artist, Pietro Torregino, who finally lost his temper, it is said, after years of a sharp-tongued provocation. Michelangelo often spoke of his ruined nose, though not the incident, and he alludes to its ugliness more than once in the long sequence of sonnets begun in later life. Of course, it seems to suit his physique, very and with a boxer's build even into old age. But it also fits his temperament, this titan of terribilita, who said he took in chisels and hammers with his nurse's milk. Michelangelo's nose is his emblem, and it is all he needs to stretch a self-portrait out of the nearly formless Sistine mask. Michelangelo was in his late 60s when he finished the Last Judgment, and much preoccupied by thoughts of dying, death, and the resurrection of the body, the end of time, and the punishment, or forgiveness of sins. He often wrote about shrugging off the mortal coil, escaping his ugly and sinful body in hope of a spiritual redemption. And in Sonnet 302, appealing to God's grace, he recalls the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. You peel of flesh the same souls you apparelled. In flesh, your blood absolves and leaves them clean of sin, of human urges, all that is mean. The self-portrait epitomizes this longing for absolution, the peeling away of the flesh in order to be reborn. It imagines the exact nature of this after-body experience and makes it visible to all. Here is Michelangelo as he once was, a remnant of his former self, spirit forlorn, and here is how he might be in a full-scale bodily resurrection, more like a Bartholomew, with his nose intact. For the point about the saint is that he is an ideal figure, a higher being compared to this discarded wreck. How one is to achieve this transfiguration was the great anxiety of Nicodemus, the elderly Pharisee who repented his sins the minute he heard Christ speak. In St. John's Gospel, Nicodemus asked Christ directly how a man can be born again when he is old, to which Christ gave no answer except that he has to be reborn. Michelangelo asked the same question in the last sonnet. Quote, "How might I find salvation, with death so near and God so far away?" End quote. Like Nicodemus, uncertain of salvation, he must neither presume nor despair, since both are sins against hope, and hope is all, hope and prayer. The alleged relics of Saint Bartholomew lie beneath the altar of a church only a few miles from the Sistine Chapel, a shriveled puzzle brought to Rome in the 10th century. One imagines them folded like garments. Yet Michelangelo, who had dissected the corpses and peeled back the skin to study the anatomy within, would have known that the embering does not come away like a coat. The flayed skin in the Last Judgment is not remotely realistic, any more than the impossible pose of Adam reaching out the tentative forefinger to God. Michelangelo's profound understanding of anatomy is not put to the service of knowledge, as with Leonardo, so much as passionate faith. As for the likeness, no Flemish artist would have called it a portrait. Yet this coat has a face, and this face has a vestigial animation, the head turning dolefully sideways. It needs to look like Michelangelo, even in this unimaginably debased state, to be part of this vision of a bodily resurrection, to personify the artist's prayer. Michelangelo's offer himself up to God not as Dürer has, in his divine image, perfectly beautiful, but as the shocked skin of a repentant sinner.